speaker. She's from Ward 3, Providence City Council. It is a pleasure to introduce Councilwoman Niobata Fortune.
Thank you, Anis. And thank you for facilitating this and all that you do and Hope for Change for being involved in this. Because I think when it comes to reproductive care, a lot of times in the immigrant community, we don't speak about the issues that women face. It's not within our culture to share that type of information. And so it is wonderful that even within our community that you are giving women a voice and you're talking about it. And so I thank you for that. Jennifer, thank you for the work that you're doing with the Women's Project and also for sharing your story. There are so many women out here who have these very traumatic narratives, and it's important that we capture the voices of Black women, Black, brown women, immigrant women, because sometimes they're not at the table, and we need people like you to remind them that it's important to share their stories. And also Phyllis, for being a doula, and for being a Black doula. So thank you. Cavell, the work that Planned Parenthood is doing, not just around abortion rights, but preventive care, maternal care. There are certain things that women don't have access to because their insurance, there's like this whole reimbursement process through their insurance. So like an IUD, right? And there's some insurance that don't cover it up front, and you have to pay and then be reimbursed. And a lot of people can't afford that, but at Planned Parenthood, you could actually go and get that type of service. So there are a lot of more things that they're doing. But most importantly, just for the advocacy work that you're doing. And Rep. Marcia Rangland, you know I love you. And I thank you for constantly fighting for on women issues, bringing our voices to the table and making sure that we're heard. And Senator Quesada, thank you also for your work that you're doing, not only for the women of color voices, but also the immigrant voice, both of you, the immigrant voice, two beautiful immigrant women. So I truly appreciate it. And all our, because my list got very long, so all our state reps and senators, thank you for being here, particularly the women, and supporting this important cause. So we've heard the statistics about the issues that the disparity gap within maternal health. And we know that women throughout the world experience so many challenges when giving birth. But what is so sad is that women in America, such a developed country, are experiencing some of these very issues. I still remember as a kid, many moons ago, the first time we heard about someone who passed away giving birth. And it was right at Women as an Infant. And it was a woman in our church. In fact, her husband was like a godfather to me. And they only had one child. And so this was her second child. And she had some complications. So it took them a while to get pregnant again. And she had a successful birth. There weren't any issues. After she gave birth, I believe a few hours later, she told her husband that she wasn't feeling good. She said she had a headache. And they tried to tell the nurse that something wasn't right, but no one listened to her. Within a few hours later, the woman never made it to the next morning. She passed away. And she was only in her 30s. So for a woman to go into the hospital in such a healthy condition, to give birth to her second child, and to not make it out is sad. And we just saw it recently happen at Women and Infants again. My own experience as giving birth, when I had my first son, I had a high-risk pregnancy. And I still remember going to a doctor's office after moving to Miami, Florida, and I brought my records. This was before we had the computer system, digital records, and so I had received a copy of my medical records, which my doctor told me to make sure when I find a new OBGYN in Miami to show them and they could request the additional information. After reviewing my records, he basically told me, well, you have a very complicated case and you might die. Just like that. It was a doctor who didn't look like me. He was a white male. And I remember walking out of there And I lived off of, not far from Biscayne Boulevard, and I remember the bus, like 3 buses drove up, like went by me, and I just couldn't get on the bus because I was just in deep thought. And I had met this woman, and I called her, and she was pregnant, and I called her and I told her what had happened. And she said, don't listen to him, I'm gonna connect you to another doctor. To this day, my son's 16 right now, and the doctor's name is Dr. Hanna, and he was from Trinidad, and he was a doctor of color. And I remember walking into that office, and a lot of the women who were in that office, the nurses, the midwives, there were a lot of women of color. And I walked in, he said, don't worry about that, it's going to be okay. But even during my birthing experience, the doctor's not there the whole time. And I remember when I had my contractions, and my pregnancy was induced. So one, I didn't know what it felt like to have natural contractions. It was my first child. I was young. I didn't know anything about giving birth, being pregnant. I was just there. I followed instructions, except for not eating. I ate. I know it's going to spend one thing there. But I was there, and I thought I would, the nurses and then everyone else, the medical practitioners would listen to me. And I still remember telling the nurse, the baby's coming, I feel the baby's coming. And she told me, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, no, the baby's coming. And it took for me to yell and curse and say, this baby is coming, you need to do something. And when they called the doctor walked in, he's like, oh my goodness, the baby is coming. And I started pushing as the doctor was getting dressed. And even after giving birth, I was laying on the bed, and I remember when they moved me, and something didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite explain it. And I remember when they moved me, after the doctor had left, I literally was in a pool of blood. And I had a natural birth, so I didn't have a C-section, and I was hemorrhaging. And they had to call the doctor back. And for my second child, I specifically found a midwife who was African American, but my water broke and I wasn't home, and I wasn't near the hospital I was supposed to give birth. So I ended up going to another hospital. And when I got there, there were so many things that didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen. And I thought to myself, if only I had someone who can advocate for me, who can speak for me. And I had friends there, but, and family, but they weren't a lot of people, but, they were doing other things. And everyone had an opinion, but I just needed someone who knew exactly what I wanted to support me in that process. Motherhood is difficult. Giving birth is traumatic. It's the closest thing to death. Because when you go into a hospital, a birthing center, and you decide to give birth, you're not sure if you're going to make it out. You hope you will, and you also want someone to be there that's going to support you. I didn't know of a doula until many, many years ago. I had a friend who told me about her home birthing experience. And she told me that she hired a doula. She had a midwife and also a doula. And I asked her, well, how much did it cost? And she told me the price. It was really expensive. And I said, oh, does insurance cover it? She said, no, I just paid cash. She was well-to-do. She had the financial capital to choose the option of birthing that she wanted, where many women do not have that choice. So for most women, going into a hospital or a birthing facility that's pushing drugs, that have all these machines on you, it's not a natural way of giving birth, particularly women who are not from this country. So it's important that we provide people with options. And regardless of your race, regardless of your socioeconomic background, regardless of your age, regardless of your gender identity, it is important that you have someone who's there to advocate for you before you give birth, during the birthing experience, and post-birth, excuse me. And one thing we didn't talk about is even postpartum depression. And for many women of color, that is not something that we talk openly about. I experienced postpartum depression after giving birth to my first child, and I didn't know what it was, and I just didn't feel well. And if it wasn't for a good friend of mine, the same friend, we became very close because she was pregnant as well, and in many ways we became advocates for each other. I wouldn't know what was going on in my life, in my head. I didn't know how to take care of this newborn child. And I wish I could call someone to say, like right after, a few days after I gave birth, to say, I'm going through this. What am I supposed to do? Who can I talk to? Can you provide me with some sort of resource? Can you call someone for me? But I didn't have that. I didn't have access to it. So this bill will not only narrow the maternal health gap, but it will also ensure that these individuals who are providing that service can be paid equitably, which is so important. Because if you are a doula of color, a Black doula, Latinx doula, Asian doula, there are a lot of people who want to serve clients who look like them, but for many of them they can't because those clients may not be able to afford it, or they have to do it at a reduced rate because they may not have the socioeconomic background to cover that expense. So it's important that we narrow that gap and we make this playing field a bit more equitable so that all women, again, regardless of race, regardless of socioeconomic background, regardless of gender identity, can access a doula if they choose. It should be a right. It should not be a privilege. And I thank you both, Rep. Marcia Rankin-Vasil and Casada, for introducing this bill. And I thank all the doulas for the work that they're doing, and everyone who's constantly advocating for women's reproductive health care. Because a doula is part of that care, is part of that advocacy, and it's important that women can have access to whatever birthing method they choose. So I thank all of you for being here, and continue to share your stories, and also make sure that you're capturing the stories of other women, and to also include women of color, particularly Black women, because we have one of the highest maternal death rates and maternal mortality in the country, excuse me. And it's important that we make sure that they are part of this conversation. Because if we continue to leave them out, then we will never have an equitable maternal health care, because we're going to leave an important group out of the conversation, out of the decision-making process. So thank you all for being here, and I appreciate the work that everyone is doing. Thank you.